All right, I guess we will begin. Thank you all for coming to the Wayland Free Public Library's 175th Anniversary History Celebration. My name is Rafael Abrahams, and I will be your Master of Ceremonies this afternoon. Researching the history of the Wayland Free Public Library has been a fascinating and rewarding experience. When we Brandeis History PhD students, myself, Joseph Weisberg, and Elizabeth Sims, were recruited by I'll be using a lot today, to create a project in honor of the library's 175th anniversary. We had no expectation or vision about what we would find that might capture our interest, let alone the attention of a non-academic public. Over the past 16 months, from November 2021 to March 2023, we have been repeatedly moved and inspired by our research material and have encountered more interesting threads of history through the WFPL's archives than we have been able to fully treat. As historians, it can be difficult to make sense of the chasms in time that separate us from our research subjects. 175 years ago, on March 6, 1848, the town of Wayland voted to accept a sum of $1,000, $500 from Brown University president and putative town namesake Francis Wayland, and the other half raised by Wayland residents themselves, for the establishment of a free public library. In researching this project and hearing the voices of so many unique stakeholders in the library, past and present, residents and scholars, the necessity of a public library seems just as urgent and immense now as it did back then, and the chasm in time does not seem quite so great after all. This work would not have been possible without the contributions of many supporters of this project from the WFPL, Brandeis University, and beyond. First, the Wayland Free Public Library. Thank you, Marjanica Wright, the WFPL Reference, Bibliographic Services, and Archives Librarian, for conceiving of this project and recruiting us to research the library and its fascinating history. We also appreciate the generous support of the trustees of the Wayland Free Public Library in funding this event, as well as the upcoming printed publication and library webpage that will contain our research. From Brandeis, thank you, Dr. Amy Singer, the Brandeis History Department Director of Graduate Studies, for connecting us with the WFPL and providing invaluable advice and guidance. We are grateful to have benefited from the generous support of the Connected PhD, a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation awarded to the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Brandeis University. Thank you to the Connected PhD principal investigators, Dean Wendy Cadge and Assistant Dean Alyssa Stalsberg-Canelli. Our first speaker today is Jane Sciacca. Jane Sciacca has lived in Wayland for 53 years and has always loved history. Jane was active in the Wayland Museum and Historical Society for almost 50 years and served as president and curator, worked on educational programs, and gave public talks. Jane was a national park ranger for almost 20 years at Minuteman and Boston National Historic Parks, Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters in Cambridge, specializing in 19th century New England literature and social movements, including slavery and abolition and women's rights. Jane has written several books for the Park Service, including articles for Cobblestone Magazine and a children's book for Lowell National Historical Park. Jane is currently compiling over 20 years of research for publication on enslavement in colonial Sudbury, which encompasses modern-day Wayland and Sudbury. Without further ado, Jane.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone. It is an honor and privilege to be here celebrating this momentous occasion. And I also like to especially thank my family and my friends who made an effort to come here today. That is deeply appreciated. They've always been my supporters and they're still here for me. The first library I ever went to was the New York Public Library. Good grief, over 70 years ago. Not as imposing as the building on Fifth Avenue with the famous lions where you guarding all that impressive knowledge, but the branch library that was around the corner from where I lived on 110th Street. I used to go there at least once a week to check out, I think it was 6 books, that was the maximum, on the childhoods of famous people. I checked this on eBay because I wasn't sure I remembered these plain orange covers that only, and no pictures on the cover, but it only had the name of the famous person and said it was their childhood. As for an only child in a New York City apartment, they were my constant companions and friends. Was this branch bigger than the Wayland Free Public Library? I don't remember, but it was my local library, just like the one here has been for 53 years. And like the branch of the New York Public Library, I've come to love the Wayland Free Public Library, but for a longer time and in many different ways. When I first came to Wayland with its 2 traffic lights and the train was still running to Boston, the library was much more like what it used to be when I was a kid, filled with books. But today the library provides not just books, but access to even more books through the Minuteman Library Network. I find briefly using this service to aid in various research projects. Even now, there are still a few things not on the internet, and even if they are, I like the hard copies. I like getting movies here and watch them for free and keep them for a time, unlike the streaming services where you have to watch them within a very short time. There were no movies to borrow in 1970 when I arrived in Wayland. I also love the book sales, and I'm going to give a big shout out to it because it's wonderful. I am quite the book hoarder, and I confess I much prefer owning books than borrowing them, and especially history books, which I like to write in. So the prices at the book sale are great, as is the selection. By the way, internet access is also excellent here. The embrace of new technology is impressive, and guidance is cordially available as to how to use it for older people like me. I remember coming down here to download a file I could not access at home. The library's program offerings are many and varied, and I have attended a number of them. Great effort has been made to reach a wide variety of audiences and topics. There is truly something here for everyone. Undoubtedly, my happiest memories go back to the early 2000s when my husband Tom and I brought our then very young grandchildren to attend programs and story hours. When we first arrived in Wayland in 1970, we had an 11-month-old son who was joined by a sister who was here, thank you, Lisa, a few years later. I remember taking at least one of the 4 grandkids when an infant to a program in which you waved colored handkerchiefs over the child's face. I don't know if they still do that anymore. Pam is nodding yes. Okay. It was quite unique. While none of the grandkids lived in Wayland, they all knew the library well from children's activities they attended or seeing grandpa or grandma give a program. More recently, we brought our youngest grandchild and our only grandson, Sam, here for story hours, special events, and my favorite, Zumba. Sam is 5 years younger than his sister and cousins. We're all already in school, and the library was our go-to place for a change of scenery especially on a rainy day. Ms. Pam still asks about him when I see her. She's nodding yes, so he's 12 now, Pam. My most frequent interactions with the library relate to my long association with the Wayland Museum and Historical Society, headquartered in the Browherd House, which is next door. Although the WFPL and the Browherd House have been next door neighbors since 1962, they were not always in the places they are now. The Browherd House moved in 1878 and spent 84 years down Old Sudbury Road near where Stop and Shop is today, before returning to its original site. And the library, which you'll hear about, I'm not going to tell you, had earlier homes that will be the subject of other programs here today. The connections between the two go back 170 years, and 75 years, and I will mention only a few. Some of the names still familiar when you hear, will still be familiar, and you'll hear them in the rest of the presentations. Sally Grout, who married John Burt White, was born at the Browherd House, her family home, and she grew up there. James Sumner Draper, a leading citizen of Wayland in the 19th century, was the librarian here for 20 years, and he was also a one-man historical society, researching where people lived during the Revolution. He made a map of that, of a Civil War memorial book. He dated trees in town, so we still have that information. We use it constantly. And the widowed Sarah Hawkshurd served as librarian, and she lived at the Browherd House, which was her husband's family home. Both the library and the Browherd House were in different locations than they are now, and Sarah would have had a little longer walk to work, but still very manageable. More recently, the Wayland Free Public Library and the Wayland Museum and Historical Society have continued to collaborate over our shared love of history and learning. Former library director is here today. You can raise your hand, that's fine with me. Thank you. And I, when I was president of the Historical Society, started collaborating on programs that must have been like 15 years ago or so. And I've had the privilege of giving a number of these programs. That tradition is still ongoing today, as it was through the pandemic on Zoom. And thanks to Courtney Michael, you can raise your hand too. I didn't have to look like a technical dunce. Thank you, Courtney. Later, curator of the Wayland Museum and Historical Society, Kay Gardner Westcott, you can raise your hand, Kay. And I have been working with MJ Wright, who was somewhere around, I'm sure, being very busy, who has been sharing with us long hidden treasures locked away for so long in the vault. The wonderful book collection of 19th century pioneer abolitionist and human rights advocate Lydia Mariah Child is now front and center on the main floor in a beautiful new display case, as are other rare books. MJ has embraced the library's history with gusto, and there have been many visits back and forth between her and members of the Historical Society. I practically swooned when MJ showed me a copy of Child's Anti-Slavery Standard, a newspaper she edited in the 1840s. I cannot adequately express my joy in seeing someone I have long admired, Lydia Mariah Child, who arrived in Wayland just after the library opened, getting the recognition she so richly deserves. Thank you, MJ. There is also a new exhibit case that will offer changing exhibits that highlight rare documents and objects on different topics. Of course, the Wayland Free Public Library has not just about been around for the 53 years that I remember, but that's why we're here for 175 years. When the library first opened, Wayland had a population of 1,200 people. Wayland was still largely agricultural with family farms that went back for generations. The shoe industry was just starting in the southern part of town, and a few Irish and German immigrants had come to town mainly for the shoe industry, but the majority were stock. Wayland Center, where the library was located, was a quiet or drowsy village, as Lydia Mariah Child called it, with the requisite New England town green and colonial and early 19th century homes. The spire of the 1815 First Parish Unitarian Church dominated the landscape then as it does now. There were several stores in the village along the dirt roads leading to Sudbury, Lincoln, and Concord, and a recently built Greek Revival Town Hall still standing and known as Collins Market. More on that later. According to Child, the most exciting event in town was the daily arrival of the stagecoach bringing news, goods, and letters from the outside world. Over the years, both the town and the library grew. The first high school would be built in the year 1855 when the library was already open. The railroad came to town in 1880, tying Wayland to Boston, and shoe manufacturing grew to dominate the southern end of town, which is known as Cochituate, and by the turn of the 20th century. Shoe manufacturing died out. This is a Reader's Digest condensed history of Wayland, of course. Shoe manufacturing died out, and after World War II, the rural town blossomed into suburbia with a population exceeding 10,000 by the time that we arrived here in 1970. Raytheon and Dow chemical laboratories transformed the landscape and the character of the community. Wayland today is largely a suburban community known for the quality of its schools. There are more than 2 traffic lights here now. The library, too, has changed. As we continue to advance into the 21st century with everything going online and embracing technological advancements, the Wayland Free Public Library will continue to evolve as the social and intellectual community center that it has always been. As I wrote in the introduction for the memorial booklet, the library is a rich mix of the old and the new, always moving forward as times change, but retaining the fundamental values that have characterized it from the very beginning. A love of books and all forms of learning, of helping others to enjoy of the world without even having to venture out of town. The library's effectiveness in meeting its mission has only been enhanced with the advent of digital media and interlibrary loans, which it embraced with great style and grace. And thank you for letting me share my memories and thoughts here. Be sure to make your own.
Thank you, Jane, for your heartfelt and well-researched remarks. Our next section will be a roundtable discussion among the 3 Brandeis researchers, myself, Elizabeth Sims, and Joseph Weisberg, and moderator, Dr. Robert Gross. At the end of the roundtable, we'll have an opportunity for questions from the audience. So let me introduce myself and my colleagues here. Rafael Abrahams, which is me, Elizabeth Sims, and Joseph Weisberg are all PhD students in the history department at Brandeis University. I study reparations and restorative compensation claims made by Black Americans, Native Americans, and Indigenous Hawaiians of the federal government in the early 20th century. I am hoping to discover connections between these movements and to understand how stakeholders pitched their petitions to governmental agents and how those agents understood these claims legally and received them politically. Elizabeth studies the civil rights movement during World War II and the post-World War II era, with a particular focus on Black women's activism in public housing desegregation. Joseph studies American Jewish history, as well as American history more generally. His research interests include Southern Jewish history, African-American Jewish relations, and the history of slavery in America. His current research project rethinks the topic of American Jewish slaveholding by tracing the previously unknown slaveholding activities of a prominent Southern Jewish doctor, and by asking how people enslaved by Jews understood the religious identity of their masters. Finally, our moderator, Dr. Robert Gross, is the Draper Professor of American History Emeritus at the University of Connecticut. Dr. Gross's research specialty is 18th and 19th century New England and the history of books and libraries in particular. Dr. Gross's latest book, The Transcendentalists in Their World, is a social and cultural history of Concord, Massachusetts in the era of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, and features a section on the history of private and public libraries in Concord. Dr. Gross has been an invaluable resource to us in thinking critically about libraries as civic institutions, and we are delighted to have him moderate our roundtable discussion for you all today. So if you'll give us 2 minutes, we're going to move this podium out of the way, and then we'll begin.
Okay, well, thank you, Rafi. Thank you to the library. I got an email a few months ago from Robin introducing himself, and they were doing this project. And would I be willing to come along and make some remarks on this occasion? Well, I think our relationship became a little deeper than that through Zoom. We had a number of conversations where I retired in 2014, and I finally got to be a graduated teacher advisor. So thank you for pulling me out of my COVID torpor. I have good memories of the library here, because in the summer of 1978, my wife Ann, who's sitting here, and I and our 2 kids lived in Wayland, and Ann brought our older son, who was then 4 years old, to story hours. I stayed home with the 6-month-old. But this is a wonderful library, and it has interesting connections, as I think I'll try to bring out later, with Concord. If this year marks the 175th birthday of the Wayland Free Public Library, it also marks the 150th birthday of the Concord Free Public Library Corporation. So this is a big year, 2023, for library anniversaries. What we talked about doing today is beginning with each of the students presenting to you what they learned in their chronological focus on the Wayland Library. And so you'll get from them initially a sense of the development over time. And I believe it starts with Rafi and then Elizabeth, is that right? Oh, and Joe and then Elizabeth. So why don't you start?
Thanks so much, Dr. Gross. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about general themes in library history, and Joseph and Elizabeth will present more of the chronological history. So there are 5 themes that came up in our research that I want to highlight for you now. The first is the idea of a library as an institution of control. And you might think of the original conception of libraries as a place where town political elites might exert their control on the rest of the people by determining what it is they are and are not allowed to read. Over time, the library became much more the product of what the public themselves wanted. People were able to have more say in the kinds of things on library shelves and to borrow things without people necessarily knowing what they were taking out. So we'll get more into that theme a little bit later. Another theme is thinking about the library as an educational institution versus a broader community institution. Of course, our event today is an educational one, but most of the events that happen in the library are more community focused, things like book groups, but also gaming groups for children. There are all kinds of craft groups that happen here. And so the library evolved not as from being a strictly educational institution to something that serves the public more generally. A third theme would be the transformation of gender roles. Like any kind of political position, librarian was a male-dominated position in the early stages of this library and libraries around the country. And I'm sure, unsurprisingly to all of you, it's become more of a stereotypically female-dominated profession. That's something we'll touch on in our history as well. Another theme is professionalization, the idea of what kind of credentials do you need to become a librarian. Again, it used to be trusted community members, often with political connections, who were in charge of the library and making these kinds of executive decisions. And later on, a development of accreditation through bachelor's and master's degrees became an essential piece of the librarian profession. Finally, the evolution of technology over time. Of course, the original Wayland Library only loaned books, physical books. Now there are all kinds of things, as Jane mentioned, that you can borrow from the library. First of all, there are digital books that you can take out from your own home, but also things like 3D printers or camera equipment, all kinds of things that would have been unimaginable to the founders of WFPL that the library now is able to loan to patrons.
Thank you, Rafi. So my work mostly looked at the 19th century history of the Wayland Free Public Library, and people who read kind of the essays I wrote will find that I was especially concerned with this question of how is it that an institution that allegedly began as kind of a conversation at the Brown University commencement ceremony in 1847 became significant and permanent enough within this community that by the turn of the century, it had its own building, the building that we're sitting in now, actually. And so one way that I tried to tell this story was by looking in the early days of the library at every time the library changed location and using these moves as an opportunity to take a snapshot of what the Wayland Free Public Library looked like. So when the library first opened, as Jane kind of pointed us towards, it was in the building that some of you might know as Collins Market, this nice neoclassical building that was built in 1841. And so the library opens there in a small room. It actually moves right around the beginning of the Civil War. It moves into slightly larger quarters within that building. And then by 1878, it moves into what was then the new town hall building, which has since been demolished, which was next door where the Wayland Historical Society is now. And then finally, by the turn of the century, the Wayland Free Public Library moves in to this building. So along the way, I try to show how the Wayland Free Public Library was able to mature as an institution, and it was able to do that in a way that was often engaged and in conversations that were happening here in town. There, a lot of you probably know that there's some, I believe there still is, some tension between the northern and southern portions of the town. In conversation with things that are happening in Boston. Obviously, the Boston Public Library has kind of an outsized impact on the way that people think about libraries in New England. And then nationally as well. So I mentioned in 1861, when the library moved within that townhouse building, they also used that as an opportunity to show their civic pride because the Civil War had actually already begun. So that's a little bit of an overview of kind of what I did. And I think as we get talking here, maybe some more of the details of the history of the library and kind of its significance will come out.
Thank you, Joe. So I primarily looked at the history of the library in the 20th century. And when I did my research, did my writing for the essays, I kind of looked at it both chronologically and thematically. So I touched on many of the things that Rafi brought up. So some of these things include like the expansion of library services and the library itself through the implementation of new systems and new technologies, and like the extension of the types of rooms available to library patrons, and the actual like expansion of the library in the 1980s. So beginning in the 20th century, 1901, the library implemented the Dewey Decimal System, which revamped the way that library patrons interact with the library. The library hired a graduate of the Amherst Library School, Miss Louise E. Jones, to recatalog the library collection and implement the card catalog system. So library patrons no longer had to use or buy library catalogs to know what was in the library collection. They now could use the card catalog system. And later on, decades after this, in the 1980s, the library joined the Minuteman Library Network and implemented library automation, which brought in computer facilities that library patrons can now use to look at the library catalog instead of using the card catalog. So it made this system that had been implemented in 1901 obsolete, and library patrons also now had access to a much wider source of books because they could access books from all the libraries that were a part of the Minuteman Library Network. So in these ways, the library patrons had access to more materials than they had before. You also see the addition of new materials available to library patrons with video cassette tapes and the DVDs, and now you have like 3D printing. So there's more avenues to learn and to engage in entertainment for people who visit the library. And with regards to like the extension of the library through the rooms available to patrons and the Smithsonian Library itself, you see the construction of the children's room in the late 1950s in the former Francis Shaw room and the civil defense room, which provided a larger space for children to learn and have fun. And then you see the expansion of the library, the addition that we're in right now that finished in the 1980s, that provided more room for the collection so that there were a wider source of books for library patrons to utilize. And one of the other themes that I touched on in my work was the growth of civic engagement and community building in the library. As I mentioned earlier, you had the Francis Shaw Room, which was used for community and government organizations to have a meeting place or to have events. And the Civil Defense Room, as I also mentioned earlier, was part of a wider national trend, and that started in World War II when the country was worried about enemies bombing civilian sites. So we wanted to have places for civilians to go to in the event of a bombing. This extended into the Cold War when they were afraid of nuclear bombing. And where the libraries come in is that they saw the library as a great place to have a room for citizens to go to. So Wayland Library was a part of this trend, and they had a civil defense room in the basement for in the event of an emergency, and that was eventually converted into the children's room. And then another major trend that I saw in my research was the growing professionalization of the library. As I mentioned earlier, they hired Miss Louise Jones to implement the new card catalog system, and that she had a degree from Amherst College, and the librarian who replaced Sarah E. Hurd that same year had a degree from the Boston University Liberal Arts College. And later, as we approach the mid 20th century, we see a turn towards having a very particular degree in library science as a way to ensure that we have librarians who are familiar with the systems that the library had in place and was looking towards implementing in the future.
Thank you. One of the things I was thinking about as Elizabeth was speaking is that we didn't really think of card catalogs in their heyday as search engines, but clearly they were. And if you then jump ahead in time to the early 2000s, you may recall that Nicholson Baker did a long piece for the New Yorker magazine on the junking of America's card catalog. Now, as I think we've come to understand the way in which online access to libraries enables the access to so many materials, I think that we could look back and say it was really a kind of know-nothingism that junked the card catalog, because an appreciation of how the organization of knowledge through catalogs, whether printed or card or then online access, are all part of what libraries represent, the means by which we organize and knowledge and access materials for the use by the broad population. So I wonder if we think about this lens on library history, if there are other ways in which you found that doing library history has given you new ideas or insights about your own graduate work in history.
Okay. Yeah, I really like this question, actually. And I should say, before I actually give my answer, Amy Singer, who is here, who is the Director of Graduate Studies at Brandeis and a professor, actually assigns Nicholson Baker's essay to her undergraduate students so that they can understand a little bit of what was happening here. But returning to the idea of libraries, something that I thought a lot about kind of during this project, and I think that will kind of stick with me, as I move into my own work, is that as library patrons, myself included, we kind of like to think about the library as like this open place of information, and anybody in the community, you just come and you get a library card and you can access whatever books and information that you would like. And this is actually, when you look at the history of a library, it's a somewhat, it's not really a view that is supported when you start digging into how libraries have actually worked. Because when the library itself, one thing that I noticed is that libraries, and this is true of Wayland, and it's true if you do some research in the American South, become a place where, because they're open to the entire community, the different factions and interest groups within the library all are kind of jockeying for control and influence, right, within the library. So in the case of Wayland, you see that in the 19th century, there was a lot of back and forth about whether the library should be here or in Cochituate. And so if the library was going to stay here, then books had to be delivered to Cochituate. And similarly, if Cochituate, they got a new waterworks, well, the folks up here said, we want something, right? And so they get kind of a new town hall with space dedicated to the library. And so to answer your question, I think Dr. Gross. The short answer is that I think one thing that I'll kind of take with me is that the library, more than just a place where you go to get books to read for pleasure, for research, is also a community institution where fights and that hard work of what it means to be in a community, a lot of that work actually happens within and about kind of our local libraries.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, to add on to what Joe was saying, I think as historians, we're very interested in the kinds of political struggles that happen over public institutions. And one phrase that Dr. Gross mentioned in our conversation was the library as a class battleground. And as someone who's interested in legal and social movements of marginalized people who are interested in kind of claiming their stake in the communities where they live and gaining political control, the library, which has perhaps a reputation of being a quiet, a place where people keep to themselves and mind their own business. That reputation is one that we should reject and think past, because as Joe mentioned, and as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the library is kind of an arbiter of education. It used to be in the very early days of the Wayland Free Public Library that there was no fiction on the shelves, because the political elites who controlled the library thought it was kind of trivial, waste of time, bad for public education for people to be reading those kinds of things. Instead, they were more interested in things like agricultural tracts and congressional records, but that didn't reflect what the people wanted out of their institutions. Today, fiction readers are not marginalized at all. As you can see looking around you, these majority of the books that are loaned by libraries today generally are fiction. And that speaks to the ways in which the public has earned its stake in institutions like public libraries. So that's one example, but there are many more. We could think about libraries as places of refuge in times of war, as Elizabeth mentioned. You might think, who is that for exactly, right? In towns that were segregated, there, which would not include Wayland, of course, but it's interesting to ask those kinds of questions and see where a library fits within that story, or a library as a polling place. There are all kinds of places around our country where it's very difficult to vote, and we might try and understand the role of libraries in promoting or inhibiting access to the vote.
Thank you, Rafi. And adding on to that, in my research into the Wayland Free Public Library, I saw a lot of community organizing, community building happening in the library. And that kind of made me think about how the library also acts as a place for, it could act as a place for movements to formulate and to build and to organize, especially and thinking about my own research with the civil rights movement, how maybe a library could act, especially like the Northeast, where they might not have been segregated, they could act as a place for those grassroots movements to start and to continue continue engaging in civic actions. In addition, and after I graduate with my PhD, I really hope to work in public history. So doing this project was like a first step into doing this kind of work, and having to look at all these documents and figuring out what the public would find interesting, and what themes they would really resonate with. It was really nice to have to think with the public's view in mind instead of an academic's view. It was a nice way to step back and think of the bigger picture.
That's great, because one of the first things that graduate students ought to learn, but it's often the last thing that their professors teach them, is to ask the question, who's your audience? And if you think about your topics from the perspective of audiences, you might formulate dissertations in ways that will get you a wider range of jobs. One of the other things I think is worth reflecting on here is the way in which libraries or any local institution is put in the position, does it sustain the existing stratification system, or can it be any source of challenge? That is particularly the case when we think about schools and libraries, because both are involved, as I said earlier, with the organization and communication of knowledge. And that we don't generally think, just tell us what we already know. That might have been the case in the 18th, early 19th century, but that stopped being so much the point of view in the 20th century. And that then leads us to think about the ways in which the library, started by men in the privileged classes, barred fiction, much of it consumed by women, and prohibited women from taking leadership positions. So the library collections emphasized what a dominant group wanted to be there and essentially sustained one version of the social order. So library history can give you a viewpoint on how things are changing and how quickly they're changing by just looking at the collections of what's there. Did any of you learn, besides broad themes, things about Wayland as a township, as a community? Is there anything distinctive here as opposed to what it shows in general?
Well, one thing that is quite distinctive about Wayland is that during World War I, Wayland was asked to lead a local council for the War Library Council. So it was in this region that Wayland Library is in, it was asked to provide funds for and books for war libraries, both at home and abroad. So the trustees and the library staff circulated pamphlets around the town asking for people to donate books and provide money for to buy more books. And they raised quite a bit of money. I think they raised a few $100s and like more than 1,000 books. So overall, they were quite successful in their endeavor. And in that way, the library was very much a part of providing soldiers during World War I with opportunities to learn and to have something to do while sitting in the war camps.
So one thing I kind of learned about Wayland as a community is Wayland is very proud, right, of its library history, and it always has been. So many of you may have heard that Wayland is the first free public library in Massachusetts. And this is a claim that is repeated, and it is inscribed, actually, if you wander over to the grounds of the Historical Society, it is inscribed on a plaque that was put there in the late 19th century. When that was the grounds of the library, so that people knew this was the first free public library in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, and here comes the kicker, in the course of my research, I kind of came to the conclusion that it's difficult to sustain the claim that Wayland had the first free public library in Massachusetts. To spare you all the kind of intricate details, one of the main issues is that what exactly a free public library is, it is not particularly clear and has changed a lot over time. So there was free access to kind of municipally owned books as early as in colonial Boston. And there were tax-supported libraries in Lexington and also in Arlington before Wayland. But that doesn't mean, right, that Wayland needs to stop being proud of its library, because one of the other things that I learned is that John Burt White, whose name I think has already come up, was instrumental. He was the state legislator, sorry, from Wayland, who was instrumental in getting a law passed in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that pretty much gave blanket approval for towns that wanted to collect tax money for the creation and maintenance of a public library. And that might sound like an obvious or a simple thing, but it really wasn't. So I went and I saw that a majority of the towns that border Wayland actually founded their library in about the 10 years after this. And so it's really this law that, although Wayland wasn't necessarily the first free public library in the Commonwealth, it's this law that really let Wayland, that really let the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I'm sorry, kind of expand the services of libraries that, within, from town to town to town, so that now if you drive from, within New England, you'll, in almost every town as you go through the center, you'll see these libraries. And so the next time you're kind of driving to wherever, that's one thing as kind of a Wayland community to take pride in, that is all facilitated by the creation of this institution and by the hard work of the leaders and the people in this town who helped raise funds actually for the first library to open.
Now that Joe has delivered the spiciest piece of our presentation, you can all relax. So I had the privilege of interviewing Louise Brown, who's in the front row here. She is Director Emeritus of the Wayland Free Public Library. And Louise was responsible for many of the important changes that we've been discussing in terms of making the library a community space and a place welcoming for children and for people of all classes and backgrounds and languages. And another really important thing that Louise was able to accomplish during her tenure, which is also something important in Wayland's legacy, is that Wayland was a founding member of the Minuteman Library Network, which Elizabeth touched on before, but I'll talk about a little bit more now. So the Minuteman Library Network was kind of the confluence of two things. One, the availability of computer technology to enter library catalogs into online databases that could be shared among libraries. But secondly, the willingness of librarians from different towns across Massachusetts to actually want to be a part of this shared community and lend their resources with one another. There were some towns that I won't mention here who refused to join the network because they were too proud of their collections, or they didn't see the use, or they had a kind of perverted sense of civic pride that prevented them from joining. Now, I believe the vast majority of Massachusetts libraries are in this network. But yeah, Wayland was a pioneer in this movement, and it's something I've benefited from personally, both as an academic researcher. There are some things that are easier for me to get through the Minuteman Network in my hometown of Somerville than to come out to Brandeis, or they simply aren't available at Brandeis. And also just as a regular reader, things that I want to read that perhaps my local library doesn't have, but I can get from somewhere else, thanks to the efforts of Wayland librarians like Louise. So that's another thing I wanted to highlight here.
Well, I think we should give a shout out not only to Wayland and the Minuteman Library Network, but also the Commonwealth Catalog. One of the things I've found after retiring in Concord is that basically I can get just about anything that's housed in the United States. And I don't know how common that is in other states of the Union, but it's quite remarkable now that you can go into a local library and get just about anything. I can imagine that in the introduction of the Minuteman Network, there must have been some towns that said, what? You want out-of-towners to come here and take our books away? And so you would have had that, one of the running tensions is between communities that have so much local pride that it squints their eyes when non-residents come in, and communities that have so little local pride that they also don't do anything. So the question is, how do you balance the competing claims? What time are we at?
Yeah, I think maybe get some audience.
Ah, exactly. So should I walk up and down with this mic?
I don't think you could shout.
Okay, so, right. I just want to actually say one other thing. I write about Concord, Massachusetts. No town in the United States boasts more often about being first. First in the beginning of the American Revolution. Lexington, well, that wasn't really a fight. Acton, it claimed to provide the people, but not the site who were first killed. But so I know from places that boast about being first. Who would like to ask the first question? You have to shout it out, so, or I'll repeat.
Yeah, please repeat.
The building, I understand, around the turn of the, I guess the 20th century, that, Andrew Carnegie all across the country, endowed or provided funds for, libraries. What about this building? I think somehow this is in the style of Carnegie endowed libraries.
So the question for those who didn't hear is, if you haven't heard of like Carnegie libraries, that Andrew Carnegie kind of endowed and helped build. And the question is there any relationship between, or what is the relationship between this library and kind of the Carnegie libraries? And the answer is that I don't think there's much of any relationship. So this library was built on land that was donated by Warren Roby, who was a local industrialist entrepreneur. Who lived kind of here, and actually part of this extension at some point was not part of. So if you kind of look behind you, you can kind of see how this is. We're in an extension of the original building, which was there, and Roby lived in this house. Okay. And so this particular library is not kind of roped into the Carnegie Library history. It's a little bit more of a local story in terms of the funding. And it was actually, I'll tack this on. When they built this library, I don't know how many folks were around for the big flood about, what, a decade ago? 2010. Yeah. So there's like a swamp right here, and they knew this when they first built this library at the turn of the century. And so you actually see in the reports of the building committee that they tried to get other land to build the library. They wanted to know if they could still use the bequest, which had I think about $28,000 of cash, but just build it somewhere else because they didn't like this piece of land, and they couldn't. So that's kind of how this library gets here, is because of a very particular bequest from Warren Roby, who gives the town this gift that we're still enjoying over a century later.
To add one thing, if you were not here during the flood, there are some really nice photos in exhibit up front. One of the library flooded, and another of one of the very young library patron riding in a canoe to access the library when you couldn't go by foot. So I encourage you to see the photo exhibit as well as a few others of artifacts and other kind of historical information in the front of the library.
The person in the canoe was desperately worried about overdue books. Any other questions? Yeah.
If libraries have played into your research of reparations in different places?
Thank you. So the question was whether I've done any work on reparations and libraries. It's a really good question, actually, even though the connection should seem obvious. Having worked on both projects, I hadn't thought to connect them. It's interesting. I wish I had more to say about it, but I could imagine, again, I don't know if this existed or not, but I could imagine marginalized groups advocating for things like literacy programs, of course, desegregation, access to various resources that libraries have, access to polls. So that's something that I'd like to research more, but I don't have much to say about it now, unfortunately.
One question from the Zoom, and you may have covered this, but she says, I remember my grandfather telling me of the first library in Wayland in the First Parish Church. Did that library involve in any way? Was that the first public library in Wayland?
Yes. So again, remember when I said that what is a free public library is really hard to put your finger on. So in the church, kind of back in the 19th century, John Burt White, again, this guy keeps coming up, but he organized what they called the East Sudbury Charitable Library, which was like a collection of free books. It was probably the first, what I'll say is that it's probably the first collection of books that was freely accessible to any resident of the town or parishioner, because there's no separation of church and state in Massachusetts until 1835. And so it's not a free public library in the sense that it's not a tax-supported library. And I believe most of the books, because it's at the church, are religiously kind of oriented. But it is significant in that it is this collection of books at the church, this charitable library, is the first attempt at making books available to those who might not be able to afford them within the town.
One last question.
Right here, right here.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm also hi, I'm Andy. I'm also a graduate student at Brandeis, so this is really nice for me to see what other graduate students are doing at other departments that I'm not involved in. I'm curious because technology has come up a couple times in the conversation, and I think nowadays when we talk about community, the community is also in online spaces. And so I'm curious how you've seen that play out, if there is a conversation around the community of Wayland, the physical community of Wayland, the online community of Wayland, how that at all interacts with sort of library and just the event. Thank you.
So I think you see a lot with the online community with the Minuteman Library Network. So how it works is that like online, you can go onto the Wayland website and look up where books are available. So not just in Wayland Library, but in other libraries, and also request them. So I think around like the online community has gone beyond Wayland itself. It's now all the libraries involved in the communities involved in the Minuteman Library Network. So now you have most of the state can also be considered part of the Wayland community, that they can now access the same materials that Wayland residents also have access to.
Yeah, I've also heard from a number of current patrons what a great resource the library was during COVID, especially that the online groups really kind of blossomed, and people really took refuge in the online community available through WFPL. Things like book clubs were, and I believe it still are, held in hybrid formats. So even people today who aren't able to come in person to the library for whatever reason are able to access community events, but also things like speakers. There have been a number of distinguished speakers here in Wayland, both during COVID lockdowns and today through a hybrid format. I will mention Wayland legend David Hackett Fisher, who's a very distinguished historian, was a Brandeis professor as well. He gave a talk a couple of months ago on his newest book that was, I attended in person, but many people attended online. And there was also Lydia Maria Child, the abolitionist who we mentioned, there's a new biography of her that came out by, I believe, the historian Lydia Moser. And again, another community event available to people in person and online. So I believe that's here to stay. I hope that it is, because Zoom really opens up these kinds of events to people who couldn't have accessed them otherwise.
Yeah, and kind of the last part of that is that I think in terms of forward facing, that it also gives kind of this new technological network, gives people who have intersected with Wayland a chance when they leave, or if they're, I guess if they leave, or if for whatever reason they're not able to come in, it gives them a way to still be connected here in a way that, through Zoom and through kind of using the Digital Commonwealth, which is this online catalog, we were able to get Dr. Gross to come and join us and kind of create this secondary group of people who are not necessarily from Wayland, but who are able to kind of create connections within this community. And I think that's a really valuable way to kind of shorten shorten the physical distance so that we're able to continue to kind of include more people into into the Wayland community.
So in the interest of time, we're going to move on from this roundtable. Just give us a moment to move the podium back, and Dr. Gross will deliver his remarks in just a moment. Thank you. All right, thank you again for all of your fascinating questions. We'll be lingering afterwards if you want to address any of us and ask more. We'd love to hear from you. In our final section today, Dr. Gross will give a talk titled "The Public Library and the Community: Reflections on Wayland's Experiences." Dr. Gross will reflect on WFPL's unique history as a pioneering library and its place in the broader context of Massachusetts, New England, and the nation at large.
Well, thank you, Rafi. I just want to begin, since I write about history of Concord, by noting that there's some interesting intertwining of Wayland's and Concord's history. It turns out that when Wayland was struggling with whether or not it could raise money through taxation on the inhabitants to sustain the library that the town had achieved the matching gift from Francis Wayland, everybody said, what should we do? They consulted Samuel Horn of Concord, who was one of the leading lawyers in the state, and he said, I guess you needed state law. In addition, Concord was one of the first towns in Massachusetts to establish a tax-supported library after the law was passed. So you actually have a kind of interesting linkage between Wayland's initiative, Concord's own activities, and the state law. It's also the case that there's a letter that's frequently cited from someone called Reverend E.H. Hurd to Francis Wayland about, and Hurd was a graduate of Brown, about Wayland's efforts to build a library. I went and read the document. It turns out E.H. Hurd was a man named Edwin Hartwell Hurd, not a reverend, actually a graduate of the Brown University class of 1851, writing to the president of Brown, where he had just been a student. And he was actually in Concord at the time, describing Concord's efforts to build a library. So in a kind of interesting way, the Wayland Concord story gets deeper and deeper. So, but today, I'm going to be talking about Wayland's history, which drew me in. We are, after all, observing three landmarks in one today. The first is the 175th anniversary of the founding of this public library. A notable achievement of longevity that deserves celebration in its own right, whatever number Wayland represents in the founding of public library. Second of all, Wayland claims a pride of place as one of the earliest tax-supported public libraries in Massachusetts and the US, and is a driving force in the passage of the state public library law of 1851, thanks to the conscientious labor of Representative John Burt White in the legislature, and of course, the savvy advice of Samuel Hoare of Concord. And third of all, we mark and can celebrate Wayland's embrace of its library as integral to the civic life and identity of the community. How did those developments come into being? None of them was inevitable. Nothing in the history of the colonies nor in the new American nation predicted the creation of tax-supported public libraries for the benefit of the citizenry. Benjamin Franklin's library company was a voluntary association entered into by subscribers paying for a share of the enterprise. The great collections of the 19th century, such as the Boston Athenaeum, were built on private wealth. The turn to public libraries marked a notable break with the past. How did that happen? How did Wayland come to play a signal role? And how did public libraries become central to our public life? So much so that, as the late novelist E.L. Doctorow has commented, the three most important documents a free society gives are a birth certificate, passport, and a library card. Actually, libraries had a mixed character in the new American Republic. For more than 50 years, from the 1790s to the 1850s, libraries in Massachusetts and New England rested on private initiative. Typically, citizens of a town would come together, agree to form a library society, elect officers, and contribute funds for a collection of books. But these actions also had a public character because they promised to promote the general welfare through the dissemination of knowledge. The Massachusetts General Court in March 1798 awarded corporate privileges to social libraries, enabling them to hold property up to $500 in value, to assess shareholders for annual dues, and to govern themselves for the benefit of the members. With this legislation, Massachusetts helped to spark what has been called the golden age of social libraries. 1790s were the takeoff period, with 69 Massachusetts towns launching such organizations. East Sudbury was one of them, inaugurating its social library under the leadership of town minister Josiah Bridge in 1796, 2 years before the state law was passed. East Sudbury was thus an early adopter in a rising trend. The group had 32 charter members, a base of support that was typical of the time. Some 60% of social libraries had between 25 and 49 founders who were willing to pay $1 to $4 a share. East Sudbury's founders were big spenders. They pledged $4 each to enjoy the privilege of borrowing books from the collection, one book at a time for up to 3 months. And in so doing, they aimed to benefit the community as well as themselves. Public as well as private happiness, Reverend Bridge wrote in a preamble to the group's constitution. Public as well as private happiness essentially depend on the general diffusion of knowledge. And the easiest and most direct way to obtain that knowledge is by the free use of well-chosen books. This was a strong start, given that the population in the mid-1790s was roughly 820 people. The proprietors of the social library constituted somewhere between 15 and 20% of adult males in the community, that had only become an independent township a decade and a half earlier. They were signing on to what would emerge over the several decades as a characteristic American institution, that is, the voluntary association, which the French observer Alexis Tocqueville deemed a crucial engine and safeguard of democracy in America. It was a crucial break with the inclusive character of the New England town, which purported to include all individuals and all inhabitants in a common way of life. But the social library gathered together only a minority of citizens in pursuit of interests shared by themselves, but not necessarily by others, though the organization professed to advance the good of all. Actually, the proprietors of the East Sudbury Social Library confined the privileges to themselves. The Constitution prohibited the lending of any book to non-members. Violation of this rule would result in a fine equal to the cost of the volume. And if an individual refused to pay, his share in the library could be seized and sold. Not that there were a lot of opportunities to enjoy the collection. The library was open to borrowers on the first Monday of each month from 1 to 9 p.m. No one could take out a book until a previous loan had been returned. And you better not keep a book beyond its due date. Late fees amounted to 33 cents, more than the annual 25-cent assessment on shareholders. The East Sudbury Social Library never anticipated the Wayland Free Public Library's recent decision to go fine-free. They're not your founding father. None of these organizational details reveal what the social library intended to include under the rubric of useful knowledge. That category could be as wide or narrow as the members wish. According to Alfred Wayland Cuddy, the officer who made these decisions was Reverend Bridge, who probably chose and purchased all the books, perhaps in consultation with his 4 colleagues on the board of directors. But Bridge never explained his selection. We can only discern his preferences from the books listed in the record. The collection launched in 1796 with 36 volumes, and after 4 years it had grown to around 75, making it actually one of the smallest social libraries in New England. This may be an undercount. The East Sudbury Social Library did not record its purchases year by year. But in 1822, the directors drew up a catalog of the books on hand. And by checking the dates of original publication, I discovered that the vast majority of the 79 titles on the list were published and offered for sale between 1795 and 1799. In effect, after an auspicious start, the social library ran out of steam, probably because Reverend Bridge died suddenly in 1801, and nobody took up the slack. Without his leadership, the collection may have frozen in place. A miscellany of works from the 18th century, most of them first published in Britain, it included histories, biographies, geographies, and travels, advice manuals for young ladies, broad-minded arguments of Christianity, and attacks on deism, poetry and ballet, and popular novels. Even the Gothic tale of the English writer Anne Radcliffe, The Mysteries of Udolpho, whose supernatural story of a young French woman held captive in a gloomy castle in the 16th century European countryside, was first taken out by the minister himself. Clearly, Reverend Bridge employed a broad definition of useful knowledge with an appreciation of imaginative literature that would not be shared by his 19th century successors at the social library's helm. This assortment of works from the late 18th century was soon outdated. With few new additions over the next 2 decades, it was increasingly out of touch with the interests and tastes of a rising generation. By 1811, the librarian was obliged to acknowledge a great diminution of interest in the collection, with just 6 individuals requesting access to the books. For the next decade, the organization was inactive and membership dwindled. In 1821, an effort to revive the library by reducing the price of shares from $4 to, they tried to revive, an effort to revive the library by reducing the price of shares from $4 to $3, but raising assessments from 25 to 50 cents, had mixed results. From a cohort of 32 founders in 1796, the number of proprietors fell to 21 in 1822, 23, in 21 in 1822, 23, then to 18 in 1825, and 17 in 1832. The collection numbered just 115 volumes. Once again, the social library lapsed into inactivity. New leadership and a shifted direction were imperative if the organization was to survive. And that came in the 1830s when the minister John Burt White and the lawyer Edward Mellon, the 2 residents most responsible for the chain of events leading to the establishment of the public library, took the helm of the voluntary association. The 2 men picked up on a growing demand for books about the world in which they live. Useful information now meant matters of fact, histories, biographies, travel, practical science, the latest reports about the past and the present. Libraries are for the living, not the dead, opined a contemporary in Concord. In this spirit, the East Sudbury Social Library sought out popularizations of the latest scientific and intellectual discoveries. It acquired 17 volumes of the inexpensive Harper's Family Library and a dozen pamphlets in the series known as Knowledge for the People, first issued in London and reprinted in Boston. These latter works aim to familiarize readers with advances in botany, chemistry, geology, mechanics, mineralogy, and zoology, among other topics. The library also caught the mania for the Scottish novelist Sir Walter Scott. It bought 11 of his works in a single order in May 1832. His imaginative novels won wide acceptance for the history they recounted and the solid morality they taught. The collection rose to 227 volumes at the same time as the price of shares dropped to $2 and dues to 25 cents. These measures apparently made little difference. In 1836, only 20 proprietors were paying the annual assessment. And then the record book peters out with no entries after March 1843. And the old volume in which the records were kept was soon bearing marks of much mutilation. The social library had evidently run out of life when Edward Mellon arranged for Francis Wayland's offer to the town. The social library was not the only private collection to precede the town library. In 1815, the new minister, John B. White, assumed the pulpit of the Congregationalist Church. And when he was not preaching the gospel on the Sabbath, he was propagating his faith in books. The Brown University graduate was said to be a bibliomaniac who built up his own home library, even as he was steering the course of the social library. But White also thought that access to books should be free to everyone and not restricted to proprietors with money to spare. So not long after settling in East Sudbury, he started a charitable library of moral and religious books and made it available to anyone in town upon request. By hook and by crook, from donations, purchases, and loans, he accumulated some 300 volumes, which were said to be a highly valued source of information to a large class of readers of all ages, including children. Unfortunately, no records survived to document the collection. Did it consist of religious works of a liberal disposition in keeping with the Unitarianism the minister would embrace? Or did it have a wider non-sectarian reach? While White was minister, the collection resided at his home. But after he stepped down from the pulpit, the books were transferred to the meeting house, where they evidently suffered neglect. By the time the public library was founded, only 70 of White's moral and religious books were in good enough condition to find new readers under the secular auspices of the town. In any event, by 1847, the town of Wayland hardly looked like a candidate to lead the way in Massachusetts, the establishment of a tax-supported public library. The social library was moribund, the charitable library untended. The only hope for young readers lay with the half-dozen school district libraries, which the town, along with many others, had established under a state law of 1845. The situation in Wayland was not unique. Concord's social library, founded in 1821, was in crisis by the mid-1840s, after a robust 2 decades of steady growth and strong circulation. The library followed a strategy to which each Sudbury counterpart was a latecomer, acquiring books detailing the progress of science and technology and acquainting readers with an expanding world, at least as recognized by white Americans and Europeans. Fiction was welcome too, in the form of the historical novels written by Walter Scott, or those in imitation of him, such as The Respectable Tales of James Fenimore Cooper, Catherine Sedgwick, and Lydia Maria Child. All this was useful knowledge, but it no longer sufficed to sustain the enterprise. Unlike East Sudbury, Concord allowed non-members to take books out for a small fee, and the revenues generated from such circulation helped to keep their library afloat. This business model required the library to stock the popular works of the day, notably fiction, but the managers were selected, while historic romancers were acceptable for the lessons they taught. The cheap, sensational stories that soared in popularity during the 1840s were not. So readers turned to commercial circulating libraries to meet their demand. And so the Concord Social Library went into decline. Acquisitions, which had ranged from 20 to 30 titles annually, were reduced to a handful. Donations dried up. Circulation plummeted. Proprietors were ignoring their bill, and it became necessary to auction off their shares of stock. And it's happened in East Sudbury, the value of those shares fell by half. In Concord's case, from $5 to $2.50. What options were there to address this bibliographical crisis? Could the social libraries compete for readers by stocking up on cheap fiction? That strategy posed a conundrum because it went to the very heart of the identity of the social library as an institution. As such advocates of libraries as Wayland's Reverend White sought, the dissemination of useful knowledge promoted intellectual and moral advance. It lifted the cloud of ignorance, awakened slumbering talent, and developed the character of intelligent, well-informed, useful, and respectable citizens. Libraries just help to educate the informed citizenry required to sustain a republic based on popular consent. Another benefit of social libraries was that they made available to enterprising working men the information about science and technology necessary for economic innovation and material progress. Libraries were instruments of self-education for upward social mobility. Without them, where would the future Benjamin Franklins of America come from? Finally, libraries would not only drive out ignorance and poverty, they would also combat a unique problem arising from good fortune. This was a challenge that preoccupied Brown President Francis Wayland. In July 1838, he spoke at the opening of the Providence Athenaeum. And as he set forth all the advantages of the new institution, to his well-heeled audience, he dwelled on a perhaps unexpected issue. The road to riches, he reminded people, was thickly strewn with temptation. Wealth multiplies our opportunities for the gratification of the passion. Hence it is that wealth is so fatal to character, and when newly made, is even more frequently fatal to character than hereditary wealth. If only Elon Musk had been there. Wayland's solution, that is, Francis Wayland's solution, was seemingly simple. Read a book. The very exercise of intellect assured the triumph of mind over matter. Serious reading elevated an individual from the thraldom of the senses into the realm of pure thought. Well, not entirely. Because as Wayland was well aware, one genre of reading was devoted to the stimulation of the senses. It depicted scenes of high society with characters in fashionable dress, attending balls in fancy settings, enjoying luxurious food and drink, presenting false faces to the world as they engaged in rivalry for romantic partners and sought opportunities for vice. Or it featured the adventures of young men suddenly rising from rags to riches, either by happy accident or through unexpected success in the army or on the high seas. Young men who were without the self-discipline to hold on to gains too easily won. Wayland was, of course, describing the genre of the novel, which in the form of cheap fiction for a mass audience was threatening the survival of the social library. How then could this institution for social improvement and moral, for self-improvement and moral uplift, how could it meet the competition? Not by making concessions to popular taste. Francis Wayland was appalled at the direction taken by the Province Athenaeum in the dozen years since its opening. In his opinion, that library had been acquiring books of at least doubtful character, frivolous and not innocent, for no better reason than that the young people desired them. In March 1851, the disgusted educator wrote to Wayland's Edward Mellon that he would as soon give a child arsenic because he liked him. He was clearly anticipating a superior course by the town library that bore his name. In other words, Province Athenaeum stumbles were East Sudbury Wayland's gain. It is in this conflicted setting that Francis Wayland made his offer of $500 to match the sum raised by the inhabitants of the town for a library. And the citizens, in fact, accomplished the goal quite quickly with an enthusiasm that could not have been predicted from the past history of libraries in the town. A total of 208 persons subscribed $553.90, an average contribution of $2.66, which was not all that much more than the $2 for a share in the social library. Donations range from 10 cents from a few children to $25 from several citizens. Roughly 1/3 of a town with 1,115 inhabitants in 1850 helped to match Francis Wayland's gift. But where would they locate the collection and how would they keep it up in the coming years? In principle, the energy they had just shown in raising the necessary funds could have maintained the momentum. But instead of relying on continued private support, the voters sent John B. White to the State House for the 1851 session on a mission to sponsor a public library law. Given the unanimous support the statute gained, the bibliomaniac White had found his moment. By enabling a town to tax its property holders for the support of a library, the new law increased the financial resources considerably. Instead of waging a losing battle against the circulating libraries with their abundance of cheap fiction, new public libraries could take up the fight with an economic independence made possible by the funds exacted from the citizens, like it or not. The establishment of public libraries, White anticipated, would be the death knell of their predecessors, but it was an inevitable stage of social progress in his mind. People were prepared for change by the increasing desire for information, which is spreading through all classes. And what did the leading role in this historical change do for the town of Wayland? In the first instance, it enabled the opening of a public library with 700 volumes, into which the collections of the charitable library, 300 volumes, the social library, 82, and the school district libraries, 130, were absorbed. And it provided funds for continuing expansion, which were increased still more by James Draper's gift of a $500 endowment to the library in 1863. By the end of 1875, there were 4,782 books in the collection. Secondly, the library enhanced the importance of the historic center of the town and reinforced the civic purpose of the library. With the secession of the Trinitarians in 1828 and disestablishment of religion in 1834, the meeting house no longer brought all townspeople together on the Sabbath. The political passions of the Jacksonian era divided them as well, and perhaps then a devotion to books and reading for the common good could provide an alternative faith. How fitting then was it to locate the town library and the new town hall and to keep it there for more than a quarter century. No matter that the development of Cochituate gave rise to an alternative focus of town life, which population resented the concentration of municipal services several miles from their homes. With an arrangement to deliver books to that section and eventually to staff a branch there, the conflict was eased and the library settled into its new quarters with an assurance that it would always reside in the central village. In important ways, the Wayland Free Public Library continued to pursue the civic and moral purposes that the social library had pioneered. In 1881, after the Boston Public Library came under fire for lending sensational fiction to children, its Wayland counterpart hastened to assure its constituents that so far as possible, it would never acquire morally unhealthy books. The high-minded commitment was still alive a century later when the trustees declined to spend money, as Louise Brown recounts, on movie cassettes for rental to townspeople. Educational films were one thing, popular entertainment quite another. Change took time in what was still a farming and shoe manufacturing town in the 19th century. In the 1850s and 1860s, the library was open only once a week on Saturdays from 1 to 3 p.m. for girls and women and 7 to 9 for boys and men. The latter scheduling undoubtedly intended to draw men away from drinking places into the sober sanctuary of the library. As late as 1890, much the same schedule obtained, with a variation in hours for winter and summer. It had the essential character of a visit to the library chain. There were no open stacks, and a patron would have to find a book in the catalog, fill out a slip to request it, and then wait for the library to deliver the item. This was personal service, but it also lacked privacy. And with such short hours, patrons must have grown restless with the wait for their single book. Yet the library would not introduce the Dewey Decimal System and open stacks until the beginning of the 20th century. Borrowing privileges were restricted to citizens 14 years and older, and no dedicated children's room or librarian would be instituted until decades later. And as I read Louise Brown's oral history, even when there was a children's librarian, didn't mean she'd get up from her desk. Ultimately, it would be the expansion of community services more than the historical civic mission that widened the horizons of the library and connected it ever more deeply to local citizens. I need only mention the dedicated room for community meetings, the classes for immigrants learning English, the poets gathering, the art exhibits, the cooperation with the schools that goes back to the late 19th century, and the commitment to freedom of information. I might also note that cheap fiction abounds on the shelf, or at least virtually online. I checked this morning, the New York Times mass market bestsellers, and you'll be glad to know, either here or through the Minuteman Network, you can get Danielle Steele, Nora Roberts, and James Patterson. This inclusiveness, along with civic purpose, is worth treasuring all the more as libraries have entered a new era of challenge. With a rising chorus of demand to remove books from the shelves, either because they cost money and take up space, desired for some other purpose, or because they offend the politics or sensibility of one embattled minority or another. In such cases, it is crucial to recall the faith that John B. White had in the potential of citizens for continuing moral and intellectual improvement, and in the value of democratic institutions in helping them along the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gross, for your remarks. Thanks again to Jane Sciacca, Elizabeth Sims, Joseph Weisberg. Thank you for our technical support today, making this possible both in person and on Zoom. And thanks again to MJ Wright, the librarian whose idea this was from the start a year and a half ago. Thank you all for sharing in this wonderful anniversary celebration today. If you attended this event in person or online through Zoom, you are a stakeholder in the WFPL, a researcher of New England library history, a student of history in general, or all three. We thank you for engaging with our work, and we are excited to see what is in store for the future of the Wayland Free Public Library. We hope that you enjoyed hearing about our research and that you learned something new about the WFPL, the town of Wayland, and how these institutions intersect with broader themes in American history. We hope that our research will answer many questions and generate even more. We encourage anyone curious to follow up on this work by producing their own research about WFPL and other local institutions. Thanks again for spending your afternoon with us. I look forward to seeing all of you again in 175 years in March 2198. Thank you.